Here's another week of Bible discussion. Today we're going to look at the book of Joshua. And so let's look at our plan for this morning. We're going to review not only how we study the Bible, but we have covered the Torah to this point. So I want to make sure that we're building on what we've learned as we look at Joshua. Then we'll summarize Joshua and look at some New Testament commentary. There's some tough passages in the book of Joshua, especially as you think of the concepts of war and genocide, and what is this all about with the Canaanites. So we'll look at that and talk through some of those hard questions at the end. But today it's really just to grow in our understanding of what this meant for the original reader, so that as we make meaning out of this, that we're understanding how it was originally intended. So just some review, just to read the Bible, you could kind of break it into two parts. There's the read to know God, and then there's the response. And so the response that I encourage is prayer, a love statement of loving someone in response, and then celebrating who God is. That's how I work through the Bible, and it just makes it meaningful because then it's moving it from head knowledge to action. In terms of knowing God, these are the steps that I think are really helpful. The first three is to ask yourself, what does it say? Just read plain reading of it, and then the understanding part, which is what we're going to look at today. What does it mean to them? And then from that position, then what's that kind of principle that we want to respond with? So previously in the Bible, sounds like a TV show. Genesis is the beginning. This is the start of it all. That's what the word means. There's two parts. It opens with God creating a good world, and humanity broke it, can't fix it. And so God promises to fix it someday in chapter 3 through this wounded victor. And this wounded victor is going to crush the serpent, who's the cause of the brokenness. And at the same time, he's going to be grievously wounded, which creates a question through the story of when and who are we going to learn about the wounded victor. Part 2 is when it goes from global to kind of a focus on one person. God chose Abraham and his family to become a new people, to start his plan of redemption, to restore and bless the world. And so after you read all the ups and downs of this family that I think many of us can identify with, you start to wonder if this can and will happen. Will the world be blessed according to the promise in Genesis 12? And so the message here really is God's plan. As you look at the goodness he created in the world, he wants to restore it through God's people that are dependent on God, that they have faith in God, looking at Abraham. And we look to Abraham as well, to have faith like Abraham. And then you see that transformation in Jacob. That's through God as we trust God in faith. And it's for the purpose of blessing that we see in Joseph. So this really is a book that helps us understand what it means for us to really become a new people, a new person that is transformed to be a blessing and to be part of God's plan to bring this world to the original intent, which was to be a good world. And so when we get to Exodus, that's where you really start to see evil from the world, the opposition. Up until then, it's really kind of family problems, but now in Exodus, we get introduced to Pharaoh. And so there's evil in our world, distorting God's people to serve the world's purpose, not God's purpose, and they become literally slaves. And so God sent Moses to rescue his people from evil, and with a purpose to reform them through a relationship with God, to come back to that relationship he started with Abraham. And what's unique about Moses is it's really to show us what does it mean to become a representative people. So not just a family, but an entire nation of people that point the world to God and work in partnership with God to restore the world. So that's where we get the rescue and then the law, introduction to who God is and his character. But the message is God's people face opposition. It tests their faith in God, and God is the deliverer by Moses to become the people, to become his distinctive representative people. And Moses is the example to that. He's really reminding us, what does it mean to be the Imago Dei, the image of God, how we reflect God in the way that we care for others and treat other people. And God, we really see him personally dwelling and leading his people, which really leads us into the next part, which we didn't talk as much about Leviticus. We kind of summarized it last week, but after Leviticus explains how to enter God's presence, that's really what that book is all about, is God who personally dwells with us. How does this rebellious people enter God's presence? And so the story picks up in Numbers with Moses entering God's presence, giving hope for God's people that despite their failure, sin can be covered so God can dwell with them. And it's to dwell in peace. And so now God's people still need a place to dwell. That's where they're moving to the land. If you remember, in that time, to be a credible religion, you needed to have a God, a people, and a place. So they have a God, they have a people, an identity with the law, and now they're moving towards the place. And so God's people still need a place to dwell with God. And so they're organized, and God's right in the center of their organization, and then they journey to enter the promised land. But that's the problem, is they get close, but they don't arrive. And so the people do not believe God's promise. That's the key, is you see, as a people, they move from trusting to being faithless. And so they don't believe God's promise. And so this generation faces the consequences. They're not allowed into the land, and they wander for the next 40 years. And so you really learn how when God's people do not follow God's lead on his journey of faith, they miss out. You miss out on experiencing the fullness of God's blessing. And so that leads into the last book of the Torah, which really is looking back. It's Moses sitting by the Jordan, looking across possibly to the promised land, reflecting on all these years together, life lessons learned on their journey, and how they're trusting God through it, the highs and the lows. And so before they enter as a people, he closes the Torah by writing a speech, and it's to call God's people to be faithful to his covenant, reminding them to learn from their past failures. So that's really the message, is learning. Learn from the past, trust and obey God who's committed. And he's committed to partnering with God's people as they grow to become his distinct representative people. And so as we come to the close of the Torah, the first 5 books, we get these questions that really should frame how we read through the rest of the Bible. These are the questions. Who is the wounded victor promised in Genesis 3? Will the world be blessed through Abraham's family, according to Genesis 12? Then as we get into Exodus and Numbers, how will a holy God work with this rebellious people? And then Moses writing this sermon, he really brings out these questions of, who's this prophet greater than Moses that's talked about in Deuteronomy 18? And then you hear about God transforming the hearts of his people, which is predicted in Deuteronomy 30. And so that's where we're left with the Torah. And so these are the questions of the Old Testament that, as we look ahead, are ultimately answered in Jesus. But until we get there, these are the questions that we're wrestling through, looking for answers as we read the Old Testament. So now this is what's significant, is we're moving from the Torah to the prophets. And so with the book of Joshua, we start a new and major section of the Old Testament. And so we call it the Old Testament. That's how the Christians divide the Bible between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is really the Hebrew scriptures, and it's divided into 3 sections. This is how it was divided for the Jews, which is the scriptures that Jesus referenced in the New Testament. It's the Torah that we just looked at, the first 5 books, the prophets, and then the writings. And so we'll talk about the writings next time, but the prophets is the next section. And so after we completed the Torah with Deuteronomy, we began a new section with Joshua called the prophets' history. It's really the story, not their message. Their message is like, you think of like Isaiah, Jeremiah, the minor prophets. That's a message. We're going to look at the prophets' history, which starts with Joshua. We go into Judges, and then you got 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And so this section continues God's story with the descendants of Abraham, but it moves from a creation of a distinct people called to bless the world. That's the Torah. So the Torah is all about this creation of a distinct people to bless the world. Now it's God fulfilling his plan through the people of Israel. That's the prophet's history. And so in the prophet's history, we learn that God continues to be faithful, but Israel continues to remain faithless. That's why the Bible's so long, as they just don't get it. We don't get it. And even in the land they were given, they repeatedly do not listen to God. And so as promised, Israel will be exiled, disciplined by God in hopes that they turn back to him. And so from the start of Joshua, the reader continues to look for the wounded victor and the prophet like Moses. But all of Israel's leaders fall short. We're going to look at the next key leader, who is David. It's coming up in a couple months. But while God continues to work through this rebellious people that we're going to see, especially in the book of Judges next, obedience to the law seems impossible. It's really demonstrating the need for God to transform the hearts of his people, which Moses promised in Deuteronomy, with the promise of an eternal kingdom, which we're going to look at with David. The reader is left hopeful for a future blessing and now looks for God to fulfill that promise by a future messianic king. And so that's what David's going to really introduce into the story. And so that's where we're coming from. Just want to do a semi-quick review. It's about 10 minutes, but let's look at Joshua. I just want to introduce Joshua, and then we'll take a moment to really talk through this together. But let me continue. So I want to look at the places, the people, and the timeline. So when you think about a story, the place, the people, the characters, their development, and the timeline is really what shapes things. And so if you look from left to right, you can see on this photo, and I know it's kind of small, but you can see how the Israelites are moving from Moab into the promised land, and they have the different routes that they take. They have a covenant renewal that we read about in the beginning, the story of the Gibeonites, and then you see them pursuing the Canaanites and their northern campaign. And so what that does is, by Joshua 12 to 13, in the pink in the middle map, that's the area of the promised land that they take possession of. So you'll notice they take possession for most of it, but not all of it. And yet God, he authorized them to take possession of it, which is what Joshua describes as he's dividing the land in chapter 13 to 22. And so the tribal divisions is on the far right. That's what the promised land was given to Israel. And you can see even it references the different tribes where they're located. And then you can also see the different relatives of the Israelites that we talked about last time, the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites. But that just gives you kind of a space to understand what this looks like, and helps us kind of get a picture of what's going on. And so let's look at the people next. There's really God against Canaan. You have Israel, and then you have Joshua. Those are kind of the main people. And so this is a story of Israel battling and ultimately defeating the Canaanites for two reasons. One, so that they dwell in the land God promised Abraham's family. So that's their purpose. And then from God's perspective, we also see that God fulfills his commitment to punish the Canaanites for their sin. And so I know Joshua is going to be a really hard read in terms of just seeing the violence that is occurring. And so I know that can be tough, but let's look at Canaan's judgment. Remember, that was predicted in Genesis 15:6. And so way back when there's the covenant being made between God and Abraham, it's mentioned about Canaan's judgment. And so the Canaanites were introduced even before that in chapter 9 and 10 with Noah. They're descendants of Ham, and Ham was really highlighted for his sin. It's not a great start. And so from that starting point, we read how the Canaanites became more and more morally corrupt as a society. So that's what's important to understand. We're not talking about an individual, we're talking about a society. And so, for example, one of those things that we read about is that they practice child sacrifices. So think about that. When we're talking about the Canaanites, that should be our understanding. They pursued magic. You read that there's a lot of sexual perversion. All of this can be read in Leviticus 18 and Deuteronomy 18. And so because of that, in Deuteronomy 9, 4-5, Moses wrote, "It is because of the wickedness of these nations that Yahweh is driving them out before you." So this is really God's punishment upon them. And it's clear that it's a punishment for them rejecting God's way. It's for their sin. And so think of it this way: after waiting for 400 years from when this was introduced in Genesis 15 to this point, God's given them plenty of time, warning them to turn from their sin. But God now punishes them for their wrongdoing. And so Israel's role in Joshua is primarily depicted as God's instrument of punishment. His command was for the Israelites, and this is a tough one, but to completely destroy them. The Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. So those are the different nations in Canaan. Often it's kind of summarized as the Canaanites. But this destruction is to be complete because their sin is complete. The fulfillment of their sin is at hand. And so it's going to be a complete judgment. It's how that works. And so God, Israel and their success is in part due to the Canaanites' failure. But more than that, this story is really about God's glory, how he's wanting his way to be revealed in the world. They're not revealing it. And so God's keeping his promise to the Jews, and he's faithful to them. And so that's where this is both, you see how it's a fulfillment of the promise, but it's also a fulfillment of the punishment. It's blessing and cursing, which is what we heard of in Genesis 12 with Abraham. And so that's looking at the characters. We'll talk more about just kind of the implications of this with, how does God handle war for a Christian, and what about genocide? I know those are really, especially for young people that are kind of reading the Bible for the first time, it's a hard one. But let's look at the timeline. And so it's broken up into 4 parts. You see the leadership of the new Moses, which is Joshua in the first 5 chapters. Then you see the battle in chapters 6 to 12, dividing the land in 13 to 22, and then closing remarks. And so this is what is a way to understand the book of Joshua as we're reading it. So in the first part, Joshua is appointed really as the new Moses. And yet at the end of his life, he dies because of sin, the sin problem. So he's not the Moses that's promised in Deuteronomy, but he is appointed as a replacement to Moses. He calls the people to obey. He sent spies in the land, just like Moses did. But unlike the last time with Moses, the people trust God to enter the land. And so Joshua led them across the Jordan onto dry ground. And before the first battle, Joshua renewed their covenant with God. It's so important to believe that God meets with them. And he did through this angelic warrior who was not for Joshua or his enemies. We're going to look at that a bit more because that's a really key moment, because that's going to say that the upcoming battles were God's battle. And so Israel is really spectators in God's plan. You see that best in Jericho. That was not a good military strategy. It really shows how Israel is just watching what God does. But really this first part is to show how they're prepared, and they're prepared to enter the land and take possession of it. And so the second is God's battle. And so the first 2 battles are contrasting portraits of God's faithfulness versus Israel's failure. So against Jericho, that's the portrait of God's faithfulness. God's people only need to play trumpets to win the battle, which is crazy. God delivers his people, and Israel only needs to wait and trust God. Now, the next battle against Ai, in contrast, the Israelites are totally defeated because of Achan's sin. And so if Israel is to inherit the land, then they need to obey and trust in God's commands, because God fights for Israel only if his people are obedient to their covenant. So it's a relationship. And then just in closing, the third and the fourth parts, the third part's fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. That's when Joshua divides up the land. Now, they haven't possessed all of it, but that's how they divide it up. And so God is faithful to his promise, and it's stated in Joshua 21:43, the Lord gave to Israel all the land he promised to his forefathers. So God gave it to them. And so now they just needed to trust that and take it, take what God has given to them. Receive it is probably a better word. But finally, in the last part, the closing remarks, Joshua's reminding Israel of God's generosity. He's calling them to turn from the Canaanite gods because they still have some work to do. And so he wants them to be faithful to God's covenant which results in blessing. And so when we think about kind of the storyline, the general plot, what started in Genesis is fulfilled by Joshua. That's really what's going on. You see that in Joshua 21, 43 through 45. Let me read that really quick. So 21, 43 through 45. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their forefathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as it had been sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. And so that's a significant conclusion. And God's people, so then they've inherited a place for them. They have a place to become God's blessing to all the nations that's promised to Abraham in Genesis 12 and prophesied in Genesis 15. So they have a place. Yet this is only the beginning for Israel as they enter God's rest. Notice it's the beginning. They enter God's rest because they have not yet taken full possession of all that God has promised. Furthermore, Joshua knows that even what they did possess through his leadership had not been guaranteed to them if they rebel and reject God's way, his law. And so Joshua understands that they need to be faithful and they need to follow God's word. And so Israel is only as strong as their commitment to remain faithful to the covenant, which Moses had emphasized in his final speech in Deuteronomy. We read that. And then which Joshua has done a good job in leading God's people to do this to this point in the story. So Joshua's really led his people well in the book of Joshua. Yet you see that Joshua closes the book by calling on the next generation to finish what they started. God had given them the right to everything he had promised. You see that in Joshua 1:4. And so they're authorized to take full possession of the entire land as soon as they needed it and as soon as they called on the Lord. So the story ends with a question of whether the next generation will finish what Joshua started by remaining faithful to God, which is especially in question without a new leader. There's no leader identified to follow Joshua. And yet the real message here is simple. God is faithful to his promise. God is faithful to his promise. The long journey through the wilderness for God's people is over. They entered the land. They subdued the enemies. They found rest on every side. And just as this new generation led by Joshua was called to renew their commitment to God before entering the land, which is what they do at the end, now the next generation is, Joshua, they renewed their covenant at the beginning of Joshua. Now at the end of Joshua, the next generation is also called to follow in their footsteps by placing their full trust in God's powerful presence to provide what he promised. And they're going to step out in faith to do it, to take possession of the entire land given to them. So there's more work to do. There's more battles ahead of them, but the next generation can look to God, who is faithful to his promise. Now, I want to close before we talk. I want to look at really two key moments. We mentioned one of them, which is really in that kind of preparation section, the first 5 chapters. And so Joshua 5, you read this amazing story where he's with this angelic warrior. I want to pull it up here with as we're looking at this together. Okay, so now first, as if all the previous preparatory events were not sufficient enough to express God's intention to give Joshua the land, this is kind of the final revelatory meeting that he has with God. And so think of Joshua from his perspective. Moses has been this incredible leader. He's following in his footsteps. Will God do for Joshua, with Joshua, like he did for Moses? Those are the questions that are being asked. And so Joshua has already been called to replace Moses in a Moses-like call in chapter 1. He was affirmed by their crossing of the sea into the promised land in chapter 3. These are all kind of retelling the story through the lens that Joshua is the new Moses. And then you have this renewed covenant of chapter 5. And so now after all that, this unique story where the leader of God's armies meets with the head of Yahweh's army, an encounter that the text says requires Joshua to remove his sandals due to it occurring on holy ground. This is in chapter 5, verse 15. What does that remind us of? Well, that's an unmistakable reference to Exodus 3, 1 through 6, which started everything for Moses. And so God is truly with Joshua as he was with Moses. And so having led according to God's will, Joshua here received God's full approval and affirmation for his obedience to God. So that's really important to see that from the writer's perspective, this is really affirming the next generation, that it's not about Moses, it's about God and how he works with his people. And so that's a big step in the story, is moving from Moses, who's been this huge figure, to now Joshua. Now, the second thing is an interesting part. Joshua asks if the angel is on the Israelite side or the enemies. And so with these words, Joshua reveals that his understanding of the battle ahead is kind of seen like this, that God is pro-Israel and God is anti-Canaanite. And so the angel quickly corrects him by saying, no, I'm the captain of the Lord's army. And the point is clear. God is going to bring his judgment on human evil, because God fights for what is good and he's against what is evil. We've seen that since Genesis and Exodus. And so this is not about Israel versus Canaan. The real question is whether Israel is on God's side. And what this means for Joshua is Israel is not above God's law. They will be held accountable to the same standard God has for Canaan and really for the whole world. And so as with Canaan, God will not look the other way. No, God does not play favorites. And Joshua knows this because Moses warned the Israelites that they will face the same consequences if they follow in the Canaanites' footsteps. You can read that in Deuteronomy 28, 25 through 68. And so this is all to say, this angelic warrior is a personal reminder for Joshua to focus on faithfulness. Focus on faithfulness to God, and not to worry as much about the future battles. Remember, God fights for Israel when his people are faithful, they're obedient to their covenant with God. And so that's where this is really showing that this is bigger than Israel. This is God, and he's fulfilling his promise, and he's faithful. And so that's Joshua 5. And then let's look, then after that, they go fight. You see the contrasting battles of when they're faithful, when they're not faithful. They divide the land, and then there's these closing remarks. And so that's where we're gonna jump ahead to Joshua 23. You know, Israel under Joshua stands as a memorial to obedience. You see that in Joshua 24:31. I want to just read that here. Joshua 24:31. It's at the end. It said, Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua. So this is a good story. And it says, all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua and had known all the works that the Lord did for Israel. So they were faithful. They did what they said they would do. And so because of their commitment to Yahweh, Joshua is able to say at the end of his life that no one was able to withstand them, because the Lord God fought for them just as he had promised. And that's in Joshua 23, 9 to 10. Let me read that really briefly here. It says, for the Lord has driven out before you great and strong nations, and as for you, no man has been able to stand before you to this day. One man of you puts to fight 1,000, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you, just as he promised. And so this is God's battle. This is God's work, and he did it. And yet, as successful as Joshua was to model obedience to the next generation, there is no leader appointed to continue the work as Moses had accomplished in calling God to appoint his replacement with Joshua before he died. So you remember that Moses was really committed to making sure that God appointed the next leader. And so this leadership vacancy that we see at the end of Joshua is both an opportunity, but more importantly, a reminder for the reader that success is not only in individuals living an obedient moral life, but in successfully passing the baton to the next generation of leadership, helping others, helping them to follow God so that God's work continues with God's people, because the work continues. And it's to see this work continue for generations to come. And so as we conclude Joshua, it really ends with this question of whether they will remain faithful to God, which is especially in question without a new leader identified. Without leadership, what will happen to God's people? That's how Joshua closes. So I want to stop there. And that's the summary of Joshua. And I want to just open it up to you all. What are things that stood out to you? What are questions that you have as you read through the story of Joshua?
I didn't really have any questions, but when I was reading it, I remembered how much I liked the story of the spies and the yeah, that was probably that's one of my favorite stories in the Bible.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you read about in chapter 2 as they go in, they had done that in Numbers 13. The Israelites sent spies to determine the nature and their objective to take the promised land, but they didn't. They saw it and they were afraid, and so this time they go in and they're almost captured, but they're delivered by a prostitute named Rahab, and so that's not the most in terms of moral hero. That's not someone that you would necessarily look to as the hero. And so there's some learning that we'll have at the end. We'll look at actually the half brother of Jesus talks about Rahab. It's through Rahab's lineage that Jesus comes. And so it's really a testimony of grace and God's heart for all people. It's a good observation, Drake. What else do you guys see in the story of Joshua? No, Erica, if you're there, and Brody and Sam.
Well, I wondered, excuse me, I wondered about Joshua when he failed to go to the Lord and ask about the travelers. Let's see, were they Gibeonites?
Oh, sure.
You know, in their deceptive practice there.
Yeah, that's chapter 9.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
it seems so out of place for Joshua
yeah,
because
yeah.
he had been so faithful. And I guess what it says is that we're all fallen,
Mhm.
and this is an example, a real life example to me in Scripture, is that there's no, Jesus is the only perfect person.
Yeah, yeah. And looking for that new Moses, it's not Joshua.
No,
Yeah,
still not
yeah.
Joshua. That's right.
Yeah, I think there's a real misstep, making the treaty with the Gibeonites,
Right.
the Canaanite country that they mistake for foreigners. So it was a mistake.
Mhm.
But even this misstep leads to a great victory. So it just shows God's grace that there's that story where he makes the sun stand still so that victory can be achieved. So you see that dramatic presence, that powerful presence of God.
Right.
But a lot of grace in this story. I mean, they messed up, made a mistake there. They're disobedient with AI trying to cover it up. And we'll talk about that too. But yeah, I think Joshua is an interesting story for us. Thank you, Judy. Any other comments, Sam or Erica? Oh, I think you're on. There it is. Oh, here we got Erica, or let's go with Sam and then Erica.
Oh, sorry. No, I didn't have anything to add. I was just saying, listening in and being very encouraged with what's going on, and I think it was a very helpful reminder about how God doesn't show favoritism, and He expects the same standards for everyone, but at the same time, how He is faithful and promise fulfilling God, that He sticks to promises He made to people who are obedient to Him. I think that really is helpful for my current situation of putting God first and depending on Him and not worrying about how to deal with the world.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yep. Yeah, that story is so profound to me with the angelic warrior. And I think about in Hebrews, it talks about how we encounter angels and we're unaware. And so God's active in our life, just like he was active in the Israelites' life. So we need to trust him, like you said, Sam, and let God deal with the battle. We just got to be faithful. Erica, I think you were gonna share some comments too. Oh, I think it's on mute. Oh, might not be picking up with headphones.
Hi, sorry.
That's okay. I think Erica's wanting to share something. I don't know what if you try without the headphones, Erica?
Okay, can you
Oh
hear?
yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Okay. I think mainly kind of Judy and Sam already talk about. I think it's kind of make me feel humble again, right? So on the other hand, I think God used Joshua, and then maybe even though he's not perfect. And then I think it's also encouragement, and God can use every one of us. Sometimes we feel that, oh, we are too small to be used. Oh, this is, I'm a shy person and I feel this, okay. Or I'm tired. I need to, yeah. So I guess never feel that we are too small to be used by God, I guess. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's interesting to me that the first 5 chapters are spent demonstrating how God's preparing and with Joshua. I mean, that's a lot of real estate in the book to spend on just making sure that everyone understands that God's working with him. And I just think of putting myself in Joshua's shoes. I mean, to follow Moses, I can't imagine how intimidating that. I would feel so insecure. I'd have so many questions. And yet God's reminding him, and he reminds us that he's the one that did the work. It wasn't Moses. Yeah,
Right.
I really enjoyed this. Go ahead, Judy.
Yeah. He, the Lord spoke to Joshua directly in verse 5. No one will be able to stand up against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you.
Yep. No,
That's
it's that, and that's interesting because that's a retelling of the primary verse in the Torah, which is in Deuteronomy, saying the same thing. And I think that's what we need to keep reminding ourselves, that God's with us, because he said in Deuteronomy, be strong and courageous, do not be afraid, for the Lord goes with you, he'll never leave. So he keeps re-saying that same thing. And I think, man, we need to keep telling ourselves that too. Which, as an aside, I find it fascinating that when Jesus gives out the Great Commission, the promise is often not emphasized. There's so much emphasis on go, make disciples, baptizing, teaching. And what does it say at the end? I go with you. And I think that's really a retelling of this promise in Deuteronomy that's reaffirmed in Joshua, that it's God that does the work. It's not about us. Well, let me look at the New Testament. Brody, did you want to say anything? I didn't get to hear from you, bud.
I mean, you kind of answered my question already before we started. So.
Yeah. So let me just say the question was it's a little confusing hearing God described as a jealous God. And so God, though, is jealous, not in the sense that he wants something that he doesn't deserve. He's jealous for what he deserves, which is worship and really relationship from us, because he created us. and he committed himself to us. And so I described it like, think of if somebody's flirting with my wife, Ligaya, like I'm going to be jealous because she's my wife. And so that makes sense, right? That's not a wrong jealousy. That's the right jealousy, because no one else should flirt with her. That's between me and her as husband and wife. So it's the same kind of idea. God made a commitment to Israel, and they're flirting with these other gods. And so that's where he's jealous for what is his. Let's turn towards the New Testament. Let me get my mouse. Interesting. Huh. Let's see here if this can work out. There it goes. There we go. All right. This is probably my favorite part, is looking at, let's look at the New Testament scriptures that really give commentary on the Old Testament. That's where the Old Testament is really the beginning of the story, and the New Testament looks back, often retelling the Old Testament story in a renewed way. And so let's look at some key verses, and we'll start with Hebrews. Hebrews has a lot to say about the Old Testament, and specifically about Joshua. And so this is Hebrews 4. Hebrews is a book that's really saying that Moses is the greater Moses. Jesus is the greater Moses. Jesus is greater than the angels. Jesus is greater than what happens in the Old Testament. He fulfills it. So we see in Hebrews 4:1, it says, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. Now we who believed enter that rest, for if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest. Every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. So the spiritual goal for God's people in the Old Testament is to rest in the land. They've been on this journey, and it's been a difficult one. And so rest represented freedom from enemy oppression and deadly war. It represented the gift of life and of land with God, communion with him. And so here the author of Hebrews warns that rest is not the absence of work. It requires faith, obedience, and diligence, all of which the author clearly believes the Israelites lacked. They lacked faith, they lacked obedience. And so no diligence meant no rest in his view, which Joshua had said the same things to the tribes who were delayed in taking their inheritance. That's in Joshua 17:14 to 18:10. Yet God's rest cannot be reduced to the occupation of the promised land. That's what the Hebrew author is writing about. Canaan was merely a sign pointing upward. And so that's where it says, since the promise of entering the rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. Now, we who believed enter that rest, and this is the key, for if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later. So it's saying that Canaan was merely a sign pointing upward and forward to the reality of God's rest. The author of Hebrews explained how the rest achieved through Joshua's conquest had given way to turmoil of the period of the judges. So God's promise of rest is not just in the land. It's ultimately a future destination of unthreatened, uninterrupted communion with God, who is already resting from his creative labors. From creation, you see that in the creation story, God rested on the seventh day. That continues. And so the land promise is, after all, not this sin-sullied world, but rather a better country, a future one in heaven. It talks about that in Hebrews 11:13 through 16. So a true rest amidst today's hardship is through faith, believing in God's promise for a future destination of uninterrupted, unthreatened communion with God in heaven. Now, we also see in Hebrews 13, it says, keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you, that Judy just retold. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? It's talking specifically about covetousness and discontent. But here the promise of Joshua 1:5 is applied to a Christian church. God's abiding presence is a solution to overcoming the sins of covetousness and discontent. So being ungrateful, wishing that you had more compared to other people. And so God's abiding presence is a solution, which in turn leads to them experiencing a freedom to live without fear and for God's good life. So there's nothing more essential for the people of God to hear than God repeating to them again and again amidst all of their church challenging circumstances, how I will be with you. I will be with you. I will not forsake you. God's presence is the abiding resource Christians need to experience a life freed from sin, to live for the goodness of God. And so God is my helper. Why are we afraid? What can man do to me? Nothing. It's God who's with us. He will do the work. Then we see this important promise in Romans 8:31-37. And I think of the book of Joshua, how it's about overcoming with God. And so here, as we look at Romans 8, it's just a kind of a way to look at Joshua, that after all the pain God's people experienced from their wanderings in the wilderness, God used what was difficult and painful in that time to lead his people into a place of rest and new life. And so in Romans 8:31-37, it really speaks to this theme. And I love it. It says, what then shall we say in response to these things? It's talking about kind of pain and suffering. If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. How will he not graciously give us all things? Who will bring any charge against those whom God has chosen? It is God who justifies. And then it goes on to say that in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. And so Romans 8:31-37 speaks to this theme, reminding the church that with all the suffering in the world, and with God in his sovereignty using what is difficult, horrible, and painful, which we see in Romans 8:28-29, he used those things to be redeemed for his good purpose. So the natural conclusion is to ask, who can be against us? And that's a rhetorical question to invite the reader to say, no one. No one can be against us with God, that God who is with us, he is for us, will overcome whatever difficulty or opposition we face that is trying to separate us from him. So this really complements what we just looked at, that God is with us. He'll never leave us nor forsake us. It reminds us again that nothing can separate us from his love, from our relationship with him. We are overcomers in Jesus. Now here's probably my favorite New Testament reference on the story, because it really speaks of God's grace. Endless writings have been written whether Rahab was okay to lie. She lied in chapter 2 of Joshua to save the Israelites, but that misses the whole point of Joshua 2 and does not hear Rahab's truth. I want to read that for you in Joshua 2:8-13. This is what Rahab says. So before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof. So this is talking to the Israelites that she's hiding. And she said to them, I know that the Lord has given you the land. Now this is Rahab speaking. And she says, I know the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. This is before they took the land. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan. That was in the previous story in Numbers. And so she's hearing these stories. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. And so what does that say? That's the truth that Rahab retells. And so that's the center of the whole narrative story in Joshua 2. And so she confesses the might of Yahweh and how no enemy of Yahweh can hide. And so she had heard of the mighty acts of God, which is the basis of her faith. And it came out in action, seeking their help. And so this is the example of faith James is talking about in James 2:25-26. It says, in the same way, after she talks about Abraham, was not Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. Now, James is not saying lying is okay. So that's not the point. It's that she, in her way, really stepped in, knowing who God is and trusting who God is. She gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction. And so when we look at this, it's really to say that the example of faith James is talking about is doing something about what you believe. Faith is active, which in Rahab's case was entrusting herself and her family to the Israelites. And so she didn't just believe this in her head, she did something. She asked for help. And that's what faith is. It's active. It takes action, which is what we see with Rahab. And so this is what's amazing, is for James to use this illustration, it frankly means that if a pagan prostitute can understand this, then God's people should understand this as well. And so I find this really challenging because it speaks of God's grace, that he was not just against people in terms of the Canaanites, he was against their evil as a society, but he was for salvation, and he saved Rahab because of her faith. Faith does not compel a believer to good deeds, or faith that does not compel a believer to do good deeds is no living faith at all. So it's faith with action is alive, is really the point. So I want to stop there and just take a moment to hear from you. What do these New Testament scriptures, how do they speak to you as you think about Joshua? And maybe there's other New Testament scriptures that weren't mentioned. I just wanted to highlight the big ones, with thinking about the promised land as rest, thinking about just how we're overcomers, thinking about Rahab and her example of faith. Go ahead, Drake.
I thought it was just interesting how God not only got other people to fear the Israelites, but also not just saying just to make them fear just because they didn't do anything, but how they know that all the things that God has done to them that help them win victories in wars and things like that. So I think it's crazy how he can do it just that easily. I feel like that would be cool to see it happen again.
Yeah, how does that help you, Bud, just in terms of your faith and your journey?
I think it's how God can change anybody. It doesn't take a lot of work for him just to say change something inside of you or outside of you. So yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, God's doing a work. He's transforming. And I think what's interesting is when you think of what we've read to this point, we get kind of the story of the creation narrative. And it talks about how the creation, after God spoke, it was wild and it was chaotic. And then he created order. And what's interesting is then when you look at Israelites, they walk through the wilderness, which the same words that were used to describe creation in terms of the wildness of it is the same words used to describe the wilderness. And so as they enter the promised land, God's really transforming them, making order, giving them rest from the land. And I just love that because it really speaks to how God transforms. He takes what's disorganized and brings order. He really brings new life. So thanks, Drake. Hi, Jean.
Hi. For me, why does God create war?
Ooh, good question. You came at the right time because that's gonna come next. So we'll talk about that in a moment.
Okay.
Yeah, no. I just appreciate, I think you bring out the right question. Joshua is one of the books in the Bible that's referenced a lot to kind of discredit Christianity. So I wanted to talk about war. I want to talk about genocide just to understand it, because I think there's a lot going on there. And again, it's written thousands of years ago. So this wasn't written to Bellevue 2021. It was written to the Jews as they're forming into a new people, entering a land, it's to know that God goes with them. And now
Yeah.
it's for us. It's for us. We just have to understand what it meant to them so that as we apply it for us, but it's hard because we're all about peace and, Starbucks, coffee, going to a soccer game with our kids. It's a very different culture.
Yeah, and then I seen one time that Richard was watching YouTube, and some Christianity in India, they were attacked. So I'm
Yeah.
like, why is that all I hear is Christians being attacked? I mean, physically and mentally.
Yeah. No, I
So
think
other
it's tough.
Yeah.
And that's where I think it's good for us to talk through this, because I think we're not void of facing opposition too. I think that's part of the story, is a spiritual opposition, but also a physical one.
Yeah.
And so I love these questions. So let's pause that. I want to look at it in a moment. I just want to make sure, just thinking through the New Testament scriptures, any ones that stand out to you guys before we look at some of these theology questions that Gene's bringing up. So these are good to look at too. But any New Testament verses that you guys think of as you reflect on the story of Joshua? I shared the ones that I thought were helpful. I think the one about Rahab really surprises me, but doesn't surprise me. It just really testifies that grace that God changes people, like you were talking about, Drake.
Yeah.
Well, let me go and kind of bring this into, so when we think about what we're reading, and as we read this story, can you guys see this screen? Yeah. So
Um,
as we read this story, we have our understanding of truth, and all truth is God's truth. And as we read the Bible, we're understanding God's reality, his perspective on our world. And as we make conclusions, that's building our theology. And theology is the knowledge of God. And so as we look at these stories, these questions come up, like what you're talking about, Gene. What does God think about war? And so let's look at that one
Yeah.
first. And I want to just share my appreciation to my friend Mark Fournier. He did some really diligent work looking at the different views. So I'm going to summarize kind of the different views. And that's where, as Christians, our essentials are the authority of the scriptures to inform our life and how we live and how we love people, our belief in Jesus and his work, and then our God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in communion and with us. Those are the essentials. And so there can be disagreement. And so we want to agree, or we want to disagree agreeably. And so this might be one of disagreement in our church. And I think I just want to highlight the different views. And so there's 4 views: non-resistant view, pacifism, the just war approach, and the preventative war. So let me just describe these. The non-resistance view is the belief that physical force should not be used to resist evil. It's kind of referencing Matthew 5. If you read through the teachings of Jesus, I think that makes that clear. Yet the use of spiritual force may be enlisted to combat evil. And there's reference of that in Luke 6:27-36, and then Romans 12:21. And so, thinking through your guys' study in Ephesians and the spiritual battle, you can pray for peace and you must support the government. So in this view, you could serve in the military as like a chaplain praying, but you must never be involved in any physical activity that takes the life of another human being. That's what this view has. And so now Christian pacifism, that's actually my heritage. My heritage is German Mennonites, who refused to fight, and so they left because they were going to be killed or fight, and they believed that you couldn't fight. So this is a non-resistance view as well. They're against war, but the key difference is that they'll not serve in the military in any role. So it's resting largely on text from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. So you want to look at verses that support this view. Now, the last two are kind of the other side of this. The just war view sees war as justifiable if following a specific and good criterion. So it's including things like a defensive posture, not being the aggressor, not being the ones to start a war, but defend and protect. And so protecting innocent lives is a part of this. It's to be a last resort. It's not something that's wanted. No one should want war. And then the action is authorized by the government. We'll talk about that in a second. The last view is the preventative war view. This is an extension of the just war view, but supporting proactive, preemptive military action if they believe an enemy's aggression is thought to be imminent and unavoidable. So these are kind of the four general views of war looking at the scriptures. Now, here's some important things to understand is we must differentiate between an institution God has ordained like government and individual commands upon us as believers. So in other words, while individuals are not to exact personal vengeance on another person, there is scriptural support for the human institution of government to protect their citizens from harm for justice, which can include military retribution or punishment for injury or wrong. And I want to look at Romans 13. Matthew, Mark. All right. So this is looking at Romans 13 as a good understanding of this one. So it says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. And so then it goes on to say, for he is God's servant for your good. For if you do wrong, be afraid, for a government does not bear the sword in vain. For government is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So that tells me that military action is something that is allowable in Scripture through the government. So then it's really a question of how does a Christian get involved in this or not? And so Jesus was clear that there will be wars and rumors of wars in the future. And so let me look at that, Matthew. So I'm going old school with the Bible. I got to go back and forth. This is Matthew 24, 6 through 13. And let's see, Matthew 24, 6 through 13. It says, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. Nation will rise against nation. So Jesus talks about this as a beginning of birth pains leading up to the fulfillment of what's coming with him. And so someday he'll bring justice. Until then, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars. So wars are unavoidable. And so, and this is where, Gene, you're talking about this. For Christians, the scriptures teach that the gospel will even arouse violence or persecution. You see that in Matthew 10 and Revelation 11. And so what is our response to be? Well, let's look at, pull up 2 Timothy 3:12. Okay, this is one of the last writings by Paul. And it says, indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. It says, while evil people and impostors will go on from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived. But as for you, continue in what you have learned and you have firmly believed. And so that's interesting, because that's actually where the verse, all scripture is breathed out by God, equipped for us to do every good work. And so we're to remain faithful to God's word, even if people persecute us not for being rude, but for standing for what's good. So I think that's what's key. Is we looked at this last week, we're not responsible for judging the world, that's God's judgment. We looked at that last time. So I don't know that saying that the world is going to hell is the most winsome way to draw people into the good news. I can see how it's faithful to proclaim what is true, but our responsibility is to judge those in the church, not outside the church. We're accountable to God as brothers and sisters to help each other follow God and to work through our differences. But in terms of Christians, we're to know God's word amidst the persecution, and so that we're competent, equipped for every good work. We're supposed to be about good works. And so every Christian needs to evaluate the scriptures on their own on this, but I've concluded that individual believers is not to take the offensive in conflict. I think there's space to defend or protect. You see that in Exodus 22:2, Genesis 14, Psalm 82:4, but not to cause harm. That's clear in Jesus' teachings in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:38-39. Let me just read that. Again, I'm going old school here. Matthew 5. So what's interesting is in the story of Matthew, it's really looking at Jesus as the greater Moses. And so we looked at the wars and rumors of wars, which is kind of the curses at the end, which is retelling Deuteronomy, when at the end they have curses and blessings. And so you see that in the book of Matthew with blessings in the Sermon on the Mount, and then curses at the end that we looked at with the wars and rumors of wars. But we see in Matthew 5:38-39, it says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth," which is basically a summary of the law. "But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to the one who begs you." And so it's really Jesus sharing that his way is so beyond anything that's written. And it's really to say that our mandate is to return good for evil and being lovers of peace. And what's interesting is we read that passage in Romans that talks about the institution of government. And yet in Romans also it talks about this in Romans 12:19. And it talks about the importance of peace and seeking peace. I want to read it. 12:19, it says, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." And so we really see in Romans that tension where the government is instituted to be God's agent of wrath, and yet we as individuals are not to initiate that. We're supposed to return good for evil, being lovers of peace. So I want to just stop there, and then we'll look at another hard one. But any comments on that, Jean? Because I think you're asking a good question.
I mean, well, for me, sometimes I forget. Most of the time we do forget. So if somebody slaps you, I would slap them back.
Isn't that the natural response? And I think
Yeah.
that's where Jesus, when you think about the point of what we're reading in the Bible is to love God, love people.
Right.
Jesus' love is an enemy love. So this is really important for us to talk about. And I appreciate your honesty that I too, like, my natural response is justice. Like, I want to, eye for an eye, give you what you gave me. But that's not the way of Jesus.
Yeah.
You know, and David, in the Old Testament, when Abner killed, well, Joab's brother, I can't remember his name. Anyway, that was not, I mean, that was an individual choice in not a government, as you talked about, not
Yeah.
a government battle, because they were killing the Philistines. And so that brought to light that, okay, it's not okay to commit murder. That was murder.
Yep. And that's different.
Yeah, and that's totally different.
Yep.
And,
That's
and
where
I
yeah, go
Yeah.
ahead. No.
and I think of Bonhoeffer in the Second World War. He and some others tried to assassinate Hitler.
Yeah,
Of course, they failed. What do you think of that one?
I know. That's, and you know what's interesting about Bonhoeffer is he was out of the country in the US. He prayed, felt led to go, and
Yeah.
ultimately sacrifice his life for the church, because the church,
Mhm.
the institution of the church that was, you know, the government and church in Germany was so integrated, they sided with the Nazis, which is horrible.
Right.
And so that's where, when you look at this, it says in Romans, let every person be subject to the governing authority. So subject to, why? For there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. For we have no fear of the one who's in authority. And so, what's interesting is what do you do if government isn't? What if the rulers isn't, as it says in Romans 13:3, for rulers are not a terror, but what if the rulers are a terror? That's where, like, this isn't a law. This is a description of how God uses government as a way to institute his goodness. So if they don't institute his goodness, then they're not operating as God intended. And so that's where I think there's that space where they believed that it was justifiable. It's, you know, that's where we follow, you know, the Spirit's leading. And I think I always bring it back to all of the law is to love God, love people. And so I think on an individual basis, I don't know that, you know, that's a hard question, you know, Judy. And I think for what we're dealing with, at least in my day, it's more about, you know, when someone cuts me off when I'm speeding, you know, and am I going to be quick to judge them, or am I going to judge myself and then realize, wow, I need to live out this life in an honorable way, not quick to react in a dishonorable way, but loving people, because I need to be loved too. So it's a good conversation. How is it helpful for you, Jean?
I still kind of feeling like, you know, it would be nice, or it would be better if you know, God eats up the world and and protect those who's being, I mean, you know, show up with all those people that's being hurtful, that's getting the wrong information, wrong ideas,
Yeah.
and maybe, you know, stop this war. I mean, I even saw in YouTube that American military is in the Philippines right now, and they're
Sure.
getting ready because of China is with Russia, and you know, and we should, I mean, they should just, you know, God needs to send angels or his warriors and possibly put a stop of this. I mean, back in the days growing up, it was like, you know, beautiful, and everybody was loved, and you know, and gathering, believe whatever they want to believe, but not the bad things.
Yeah.
So not like it's getting worse, because um the devil is actually out there.
Yep. Yep.
So,
And that's
yeah.
the right perspective, is that this isn't God's desire, that
No,
there
it's
is opposition. And so there's two things. Just remember, Jesus says you will hear wars and rumors of wars. It's birth pains. So this is, you know, you think about having a child, you know, birth pains are part of the process towards life, it's not enjoyable. I don't know from personal experience, but I hear it's not enjoyable. And so I think on a creation level, we're in the experience of birth pains that is pointing towards new life that's going to be in Christ. He'll right the wrongs someday. Until then, we're called as Christians to be representatives of Christ. And that's where Paul says, let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good, love others with a
Right.
brotherly affection. So I think we just need to focus on that, trusting him for these bigger questions and really looking to being an example. I want to pause this question because there's another related one that is one of the hardest questions, especially as we look to Joshua. And how did you feel reading through Joshua? And let me look at Joshua 26. Let me pull it up really quick. Again, I'm going old school here. Paper. Joshua 6:21. It's talking about Jericho. Let me read this to you. It says, the Israelites devoted all in the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys with the edge of the sword. So women and men, young and old, kids, Israel destroyed them. Does that mean God's okay with genocide? Well, this is a really important question to think through, because you will get quoted this if ever you talk with someone who discredits the Bible. And again, we got to understand it in the context. And so I want to share some comments that were derived from an article by Tim Mackey with the Bible Project, a great resource. And I just want to highlight this. And so, is God okay with genocide? No. The Israelite conquest of Canaan was unrepeated in their history. Sometimes people perceive the Old Testament as filled with violence from God, which is not accurate. If you read it, we read countless stories of grace and love and compassion, and how he's slow to anger, abounding in love. And so the conquest of Canaan took place in a single generation and was limited in time, locale, and scope. And so we need to understand that there's something specific happening here that we'll look at here in a second from Genesis 15:6 that talks about, or Genesis 15 that talks about how this is a fulfillment of judgment that was against Canaan for their sin as a society. And so that was specific to Canaan. But we read in Deuteronomy 20 how God sought peace for Israel with all the other nations around Israel. So there's a desire for peace. There's something unique happening with Canaan. So that's the first thing to understand. Now they will face future battles, but this conquest was unique and specific for the Canaanites. So just remember that first. The second thing is this conflict was not based on ethnic identity. So genocide is this idea that someone comes in and wipes out a people group because of their ethnicity. So there were many Canaanites who joined the covenant people. Rahab in Joshua 2, the Gibeonites in Joshua 9. This would not have been allowed if it were an ethnically motivated war. So using the term genocide is inaccurate. That's the second thing. This was punishment by God for the Canaanites' immoral society. So that was a judgment for their actions, not for their ethnicity. Third thing, the intense language used as left no survival, the Israelites utterly destroyed them, that I just read. It's written in the ancient Near Eastern style of a battle account that uses extreme hyperbolic statements to really show the strength of the people that win. And so, for example, there are cities in Joshua 10:36-39 that were told no Canaanites survived. And then later, Israelites go to these cities and Canaanite people were living there in Joshua 15:13-15. So it means that the Israelites did not accomplish a sweeping removal of the Canaanites. We know that because of Rahab in chapter 2. Now, fourth, the conflict was primarily with the military. So the cities they engaged with were small military strategic outpost towns surrounded by walls. So their inhabitants were mostly combatants. The conflict was largely with various Canaanite kings forming a coalition of hostile armies coming after them. So remember, they heard what was happening, so they assembled their armies to come fight Israel. So their battles were not against helpless people. They were being they had wars waged against them, or battles waged against them. So the fifth thing is we must remember that there's an untold story between God and the Canaanites, which goes back to Genesis. The Canaanites had decades of advance warning, literally hundreds of years. So this conquest did not catch them off guard as it might for us. Furthermore, the Canaanite culture became morally utterly corrupt, especially when it came to violence and abuse of the most vulnerable. So they were not innocent by any means as a society. And so the Israelites were an instrument of divine justice, unique for what their actions led to this point. So they were not battles for plunder and power. That's why Achan's sin, he was not supposed to keep anything. It was an act of divine punishment of an extremely corrupt society. And so these battles reveal that God is not okay with evil. This is not authorization to commit violence in God's name, but to reveal God's justice on human evil. And the last thing to remember is the Canaanites as nations were subject to the judgment of God. And so those who declared faith in Yahweh were spared, like Rahab and Joshua 2. And what's amazing about Rahab is she was incorporated in the community of faith, that in the providence of God, she became an ancestor of Jesus. You can read about that in Matthew 1. God is willing to save anyone. This is God's heart for the world. And so I'll just stop there and just want to check in with you guys. I know Brody and Drake, Brody, I think we were talking about this earlier. Any questions about this? Because this is a really important topic, just looking at this as God's judgment and how this battle happened.
I was just thinking that's the natural what do I want to say? The natural consequence of horrific disobedience to
Mhm.
our Lord.
And as a society, like
As
that's
a society, yes, as a
And so
society.
there was individuals that were saved
Mm-hmm,
because we know they heard about it because Rahab retold that. So
mm-hmm,
Rahab really speaks to
mm-hmm.
God's heart in this. He's not one that's wanting to do this. It's that they don't listen, they don't obey.
Right, right. And it just brings us up into our day, and that we're not all agreeing to what is politically supposedly okay,
Yeah.
and yet we have to live with it. It's not our choice,
Yep.
and we can do what we can do to fight it, but ultimately we also know God's plan.
Yep. Yep.
And ultimately the victory will be ours.
Yeah. Well, and
But
it's really
Mhm.
a victory that is for him, right? Like I think of that
Yes,
angelic warrior and Joshua, like, are
yes,
you on our side or their side? And God's like,
right.
neither.
Hmm. Right.
He's for good.
Right.
And so I think if we choose to be on the side of good, then we'll be a part of God's victory.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where we want to be. Let me just kind of close out with just a couple more thoughts, looking at kind of theology, and then we'll be done. I see it's almost 10. So rest is an important theme in this story as well. So what is God's rest? How do we find it? I think that is really important for us to think through as Christians and as a busy society too. And so when we think of the concept of rest, it comes from Hebrews 3 and 4. It was first introduced, though, in the Bible in the creation narrative when God chose to rest to mark completion of his creation, the overflow of his blessing. So it wasn't that God needed it. He wanted to celebrate and be an example to us. So from this, Israel made it a practice to rest every week for the Sabbath, which was a day to stop and to celebrate life that God has given them. So God wanted his people to remember that he was and is the creator who shaped the beauty of the heavens and the majesty of the mountains, who provided food, who gave life and peace. This is God. And so with that said, the Israelites entered rest after their journeys. So again, they've been journeying. Now they have rest. They can no more manna. They can have the sustenance of the land. And so this marked the end of a struggle for Israel and the beginning of rest by them receiving a place from God from which he will bless them so that they in turn can bless the world. So rest was a significant part of their inheritance. It was a gift that came with the territory. All that was required to find rest was to fully trust in God and his promises, which for those who rebelled, and you can look at Hebrews 3:11, they were not allowed to enter God's rest. And so for those who did, depending on God for his provision, protection, they received it. For us, Jesus is our rest by trusting his work on the cross. We have nothing more to prove to God. All of what we do for him is a response to his grace, his gift, his life. And so we're not required to stop and rest. But by doing so, we give our soul the opportunity to both remember and celebrate the work of God in our life. So that's where, taking time to rest is really good. And it's not required. It is a blessing. And so the last one is, how are the Canaanites held accountable when God did not give them the law like he did for the Jews? This is a good question. And so when we think of who God is, he revealed himself in nature. We can see that in Romans 1. And he's given humanity a moral law in their hearts. You can read that in Romans 2. And it's so that humanity is without excuse. This means that God was and is just in what he did to hold the Canaanites accountable for the immoral behavior, because he wrote his moral standard upon their hearts to know right from wrong. Now, some call this law written upon one's heart a conscience, but whatever it is, there is something inside of all of us that believes there is a certain way to live, to experience a just society. Otherwise, I could not call an action by someone else as unjust. It's not a private idea. It's not something I determine. It's wrong for me because it's wrong for us. And so I like this. One person said it best, that a man does not call a line crooked unless everyone has some idea of a straight line. And so there's a real sense in our heart of hearts that our world is governed by a standard of what is crooked and what is straight, or what is right and what is wrong. And so for humans, what's interesting is they can feel a real sense of guilt and shame when they do wrong, when they're counter to this certain way to live. And so humanity is seeking a way to resolve their internal struggle to know what is right and yet to keep choosing what is wrong. And so with God having revealed his power and intelligence in all of creation, then all of humanity knows there's a higher power who they can seek to resolve this issue. But here's the thing. The problem is that humanity is sinful. So we all reject the knowledge of God. And so God is not angry with innocent people, but with guilty people. He's not condemning us for rejecting him. It's because of our sin. That's the problem. And so for the Canaanites, as well as for us, this condemnation is based on the fact that we're sinners and not that they rejected God. And so when we come to the bottom line, we just got to trust in God's character. God is merciful for revealing himself to us in creation. And for those of us who have been introduced to Jesus, we should be even more motivated by his gracious gift to bring his good news to the world so that people can know him. And so I encourage you guys to trust the character of God, who loves us so much that he came and gave himself for us. We can be confident that his judgments are always right. His nature is good. His mercy is always wide, and his desire for people to be saved is greater than our own. And so that's where I'm going to conclude things for us for today. We have been on this journey now for about 4 months, which we've covered a lot. And so as we finish the Torah, we have these unanswered questions: the wounded victor, the blessing. How is a holy God going to work with rebellious people? Who's this prophet greater than Moses? Will God transform the hearts of his people? So the Torah really created this people to be a blessing, and now it's about fulfillment. And so as we read this history, just remember it's about God working with his people to lead Israel as they listen to him in active relationship with him. It's about relationship. God is faithful to his promise, and yet Israel is the one that's faithless, and they repeatedly do not listen to God. And so we're going to see how this is moving towards God really desiring to help his people by raising up leaders. Judges is going to be a hard one because we're going to see more and more how without leadership, they're in turmoil. But we can keep reading through this story to realize that there's going to be a hope that's coming, not just with David, but ultimately in this future messianic king who's going to lead us and deliver us. And so thank you guys so much for joining me for this discussion. Gene, it's great to see you. I can't wait to see you guys. I miss you guys. And so thanks, Erica and Sam and Judy and Bro and Drake for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
This
Well,
was
guys,
good.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. See you
Bye.
soon.
Nice.